Hi, welcome to part 2 on our segment on Indigenous Americas. Often this style of art or culture of art is sometimes referred to as Mesoamerica too. So just to clarify, we are kind of going back in time. In our Western art, we kind of left off with modern architecture, and so I need to go back and look at some non-Western ancient art. So kind of think of this paralleling with like the ancient Greek, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and those cultures. So now we're going to look at a group called the Anasazi. So this is actually a cliff dwelling, or a pueblo, which is the sort of home that this group built. And imagine what this must have been like. Imagine living in a home built into the side of a cliff, which this is what they did. The Ancestral Pueblan people, and they were formerly known as the Anasazi, did just some of this and some of the most remarkable structures that still exist today. So beginning after 1000 BC, they built more than 600 structures into the cliff faces of the four corner regions of the United States: the southwestern corner of Colorado, the northwestern corner of New Mexico, the northeastern corner of Arizona, and the southeastern corner of Utah. These structures were mostly residential, but some were used for storage and ritual. So the dwellings depicted here are located in what today is southwestern Colorado, in the national park known as Mesa Verde. Verde is Spanish for green. Mesa means table in Spanish, but here it refers to a kind of flat-topped mountain common in the southwestern United States. The most famous residential sites date to the 12th and 13th centuries. The Ancestral Pueblans access these dwellings with retractable ladders, so you can kind of see a restoration of what that would have looked like. If you are sure-footed and not afraid of heights, you can still visit some of these sites in the very same way, so you can kind of experience what it must have been like to live in one of these structures. And so this is just another view, and I just think that's amazing. That must have been so just cool to live in, almost like inside a mountain or cliff. The Anasazi occupied the Mesa Verde region from about 450 to 1300 CE. The inhabited region encompassed a far larger geographical area than is defined now by the national park, and included other residential sites. Other groups might have lived in larger sites that were a little bit bigger than Mesa Verde, and some of these structures could have had up to 600 to 1200 rooms. And in contrast, in this particular archaeological site, probably only about 125 people lived in this cliff palace that we're looking at. And this is the largest of the Mesa Verde sites. The cliff dwellings are probably some of the best preserved buildings from this time period, and so they're a very popular destination for archaeologists, as well as just vacationers and people interested in exploring a different culture. The largest of all the cliff dwellings is referred to as the Cliff Palace. It has about 150 more rooms and more than 20 circular rooms. Due to its location, it was well protected from the elements. The buildings originally ranged from 1 to 4 stories, and some hit the natural stone ceiling. To build these structures, people used stone and mud mortar, along with wooden beams adapted to the natural clefts in the cliff face. This building technique was a shift from structures built prior to 1000 CE in the Mesa Verde area, which had been made primarily of what they would call adobe structures, a type of brick made of clay, sand, and straw or sticks. These stone and mortar buildings, along with the decorative elements and objects found inside them, provide important insight into the lives of the Anasazi people during the 13th century. And so this is an example of how a layout of one of the rooms might have looked in the Cliff Palace. Families lived in these architectural units organized around a kiva or kivas, which is a circular subterranean room. A kiva typically had a wooden beam roof held up by 6 engaged support columns made of masonry about above a shelf-like banquette. And hopefully you can kind of see this is a good diagram because they've actually labeled it. Other typical features of a kiva included a fire pit or hearth, a ventilation shaft, a deflector. This was a low wall designed to prevent air drawn from the ventilation shaft from reaching the fire directly. A sipawa, a small hole in the floor that was used for ceremonial purposes and rituals. They developed from the pit house, also a circular subterranean room used as a living space. So kivas continued to be used, and this is just sort of a layout of a plan of how these circular kivas might have looked within the Cliff Palace. Kivas continue to be used for ceremonies today by Pueblan peoples, though not those within the Mesa Verde National Park. In the past, these circular spaces were likely both ceremonial as well as residential. And that's something to think about when we think about architectural structures and buildings. We need to think of, what Louis Sullivan said that we just studied with modern architecture, form and function. And, obviously, some of these buildings served both a secular purpose as well as a sacred purpose. And that's something to think about when looking at different structures. If you visit the Cliff Palace today, you will see the kivas without their roofs. But in the past, they would have been covered. The space around them would function as sort of a small plaza. Connected rooms fanned out around these plazas, creating a housing unit. One room, typically facing onto the plaza, contained a hearth. Family members most likely gathered here. Other rooms located off the hearth were most likely used for storage. And they had just enough of an opening maybe to squeeze your arm through a hole to grab anything you might need. So, it is sort of like a condominium. When you live in an apartment complex or condominium, sometimes you are given a small storage space in the basement. So in sort of a modern sense, it's kind of universal like that. The Cliff Palace also featured some unusual structures, including a circular tower. Archaeologists are still uncertain as to the exact use of the tower. And I'm not sure. I don't think I have a slide of that. I couldn't find one. Here's another view, a more aerial view. From 500 to 1300 CE, the ancestral Pueblans who lived in the Mesa Verde were sedentary farmers who cultivated beans, squash, and corn. Corn originally came from what is today Mexico at some point during the first millennium of the Common Era. Originally, most farmers lived near their crops, but this shifted in the late 1100s when people began to live near sources of water and often had to walk long distances to their crops. So why move up to the cliff alcoves at all, away from water and crops? Did the cliffs provide protection from invaders? Were they defensive, or were there other issues at play? Did the rock ledges have a ceremonial or spiritual significance? They certainly provide shade and protection from snow. Ultimately, are left with educated guesses. So again, these are theories about why people might have gone to the trouble to make these sort of elaborate homes in these cliffs. The exact reasons for building the cliff dwellings remain unknown to us. So why were the cliffs abandoned? The cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde were abandoned around 1300 CE after all the time and effort it took to build these beautiful dwellings. Why did people want to leave this area? And so this is something I want you guys to do as well. Maybe start asking questions, and that's something I've encouraged you to do in your journal responses. So try to think of questions that when you're looking at a work of art, and I think it will help you, or architecture, and it will help you really dig into that work a little bit deeper. Cliff palaces were built in the 12th century, Why was it abandoned less than 100 years later? These questions have not been answered, again, conclusively, though it is likely that the migration from this area was due either to drought, lack of resources, perhaps violence, or some combination of these factors. We know, for instance, that droughts occurred from 1276 to 1299 CE. These dry periods likely caused a shortage of food and may have resulted in confrontations as resources became more scarce. The cliff dwellings remained, though, a compelling example of how the ancestral Pueblans literally carved their existence into the rocky landscape of today's southwestern United States. And so I think it'd be interesting, I think a good comparison, if you wanted to compare like an ancient structure with a modern structure, Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater. I think, you know, when I look at this in particular, let me go back to this image, it really makes me think of that and Frank Lloyd's Wright, like his use of organic architecture and really infusing the environment with the structure. And I think I could see some similarities between these two. Right, another group that we're going to be studying is the Mississippian. And they are famous for this famous mound called the Great Serpent Mound that was probably constructed around 1070, and it's located in Adams County in Ohio. The Great Serpent Mound is in rural southwestern Ohio. It is the largest serpent effigy in the world. Numerous mounds were made by the ancient Native American cultures that flourished along the fertile valleys of the Mississippi, Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri rivers 1,000 years ago. Though many were destroyed as farms spread across the region during the modern era, they invite us to contemplate the rich spiritual beliefs of the ancient Native American cultures that created them. The Great Serpent Mound measured approximately 1,300 feet in length and ranges from 1 to 3 feet high. So we're kind of looking at a view of it from more of the center. So you get a sense of how it's raised. The complex mound is both architectural and sculptural and was erected by settled people who cultivated maize, beans, and squash, and who maintained a stratified society which had an organized labor force but left no written records. Let's take a look at both aerial and close-up views that can help us understand the mound in relationship to its site and the possible intentions of its makers. So here's a diagram of what it looked like. So it's actually really large. This is an aerial view of an entry done. So you can see sort of the serpent snake shape. Supernatural powers is one theory. The serpent is slightly crescent-shaped and oriented such that the head is at the east and the tail is at the west, with 7 winding coils in between. The shape of the head perhaps invites the most speculation, whereas some scholars read the oval shape as an enlarged eye. And so this is what the area they're referring to here. Others see a hollow egg or even a frog about to be swallowed by the wide open jaws. So they're maybe thinking like this is the mouth of the serpent. But perhaps the lower jaw is an indication of appendages such as small arms that might imply the creature is a lizard rather than a snake. You know how like little geckos and little newts, you know, they have these little arms, so they're sort of thinking this might be these arms, so it's more of a lizard than a snake. Many native cultures in North and Central America attribute supernatural powers to snakes or reptiles and include them in their spiritual practices. The native peoples of the Middle Ohio Valley in particular frequently created snake shapes out of copper sheets. Here's a nice aerial view, so you can really get a sense of how large this is. The mound conforms to the natural topography of the site, which is a high plateau overlooking the Ohio Bush Creek. In fact, the head of the creature approaches a steep natural cliff above the creek. The unique geological formation suggests that a meteor struck the site approximately 250 to 300 million years ago, causing folded bedrock underneath the mound. Here's a really good aerial view, and you really get a sense of the shape and the scale of it. Aspects of both zoomorphic form and the unusual site have associations with astronomy, Worth considering, the head of the serpent aligns with the summer solstice sunset, and the tail points to the winter solstice sunrise. Could this mound have been used to mark time or the seasons? Think of another structure. A prehistorical structure is Stonehenge. And some people speculate that might have been some sort of calendar. Maybe it was used to predict a harvest. Likewise, it has been suggested that the curves in the body of the snake parallel lunar phases, or alternatively align with the two solstices and two equinoxes. Some have interpreted the egg shape or eye shape at the head to be a representation of the sun. Perhaps even the swallowing of the sun shape could document a solar eclipse. Another theory is that the shape of the serpent imitates the constellation Draco, with the pole star matching the placement of the first curve in the snake's torso from the head. An alignment with the pole star may indicate that the mound was used to determine true north and thus served as a kind of compass. One note also in the fact that Halley's Comet appeared in 1066. Although the tail of the comet is characteristically straight rather than curved, perhaps the mound served in part to mark this astronomical event or similar phenomenon, such as light from a supernova. In a more comprehensive view, the serpent mound may represent a conglomerate of all celestial knowledge known by the native people in a single image. All right, so one last question. Who built this? Determining exactly which culture designed and built the effigy mound and when is a matter of ongoing inquiry. A broad answer may lie in viewing the work as being designed, built, or refurbished over an extended period of time by several indigenous groups. The leading theory is that the Fort ancient culture from 1000 to 1650 CE is principally responsible for the mound, having erected it in 1070 CE. This mound building society lived in the Ohio Valley and was influenced by contemporary Mississippian culture from 700 to 1550, whose urban center was located at a region in Illinois. The rattlesnake was a common theme among the Mississippian culture, and thus it's possible that the Fort ancient culture appropriated this symbol from them, although there is no clear reference to a rattle to identify the species as such. Theory is that the Fort ancient culture refurbished the site circa 1070, reworking a pre-existing mound built by the Adena culture, which flourished from 1100 BCE to 200 CE, and or the Hopewell culture, which flourished between 100 BCE and 500 CE, where the site was built by the Fort ancient peoples, or by the early Adean or Hopewell cultures. This mound is atypical. The mound contains no artifacts, and both the Fort ancient and Adena groups typically would bury objects inside the mound. So it's unusual. Atypical means it doesn't fit sort of the stylistic conventions that we have seen with similar mounds by indigenous groups. Usually they did have artifacts buried within them, and this does not have any. Although there are no graves found inside the Great Serpent Mound, there are burials found nearby the site, but none of them are the kind of burials typical for ancient cultures and are more closely associated with Adena burial practices. Archaeological evidence does not support a burial purpose for the Great Serpent Mound. So again, it's unclear what its sole purpose was, but there is much speculation. And so when you are confronted with this sculpture, architecture, it's kind of a combination of the two. Some of you have a tendency when we talk about works of art and we're not sure exactly what they were used for, functioned as, you just put "we're not sure," and you sort of don't extend your answer. I've given you several theories that scholars have proposed as to what the serpent mound could represent. So I do expect you to know these theories, even though they're not quite sure. You still need to be familiar and be able to cite them. So the debate continues whether this impressive monument was used as a way to mark time, document a celestial event, act as a compass, serve as a guide to astrological patterns, or provide a place of worship to a supernatural snake god or goddess, we may never know with certainty. One scholar has recently suggested that the mound was a platform or base for totems or other architectural structures that are no longer exist, perhaps removed by subsequent cultures. All to say, scholarly debate continues based on ongoing archaeological evidence and geological research. And that's something to think about as well, that, this kind of research and theories are constantly changing because they are doing new research. They're continuing to dig and study these various architectural and archaeological sites. So, without a doubt, the mound is a singular, significant in its ability to provide tangible insight into the cosmology and rituals of the ancient Americas. So, I'm going to leave off here. There is going to be a part 3, and in that section, we're going to be looking at Aztec art. So, stay tuned.